My name is Zoe Warren. I'm a father of three. I live in Lexington County. I'm a documentary and narrative filmmaker, a freelance video producer, and a journalist. And I've been producing commercial, documentary, and news content since 2009. I've worked in local news as a camera operator, regional news as a reporter. I'm currently an editor at large for the Standard SC. I'm the owner of Pasteur Productions, and I host a weekly show. It's distributed by the New American Magazine, addressing issues related to the Second Amendment. My family and I are also missionaries to Pakistan and the Philippines, and I'm currently serving as the Lexington County Republican Party's third vice chair. I'm not speaking for the third vice chair or Lexington County today. This is for me and my family. I want to thank you all, Chairwoman, Vice Chairman, Lexington, Richland 5 School Board, parents, teachers, residents of the district, United Parents of South Carolina Midlands, and Alan Wright for the invitation and the opportunity to share some information related to a pedagogy called critical race theory that has our nation, our state, and counties in an uproar. I was sent some materials to look over, and in those materials I saw some things that were concerning, and they are being used in our districts. So in my presentation, I endeavor to resolve generally three questions. What is critical race theory? How is it being applied in K-12 schools, despite legislation forbidding it? And how should we respond? I'm going to try to be as fast as I can. I know I have a very short amount of time. What is critical race theory? Dr. Peter McLaren, who's known as one of the leading architects of critical pedagogy, defines critical race theory as much more than a program of study or a classroom text or a course syllabus. Rather, it represents the introduction to a particular form of life. That's why it seems like an idea, and it's hard to grab a hold of. I'm going to refer to critical race theory as CRT for the rest of the presentation. CRT is more than an idea. It's a form of educational warfare. And sometimes it's in stealth. And it's under what seems to be a helpful means of teaching history, the history of race relations in America. But it's meant to wash our children in a form of racial hatred. And I want to agree with Dr. Ross that we need to have something in common to be a community. And I think our ethos, the cultural ethos, is something we should have in common. We should be able to say the same things and have the same kind of values as a country. And I think that it starts with our students. If we don't teach them right, then they're going to absolutely go the wrong way. Dr. Nicholas Hartleb, who's an associate professor of education studies at Beret, published an important study on CRT in 2009. He's a proponent of CRT, and he titled his presentation Critical Race Theory, an examination of its past, present, and future implications. In it, he evaluated the current body of research conducted on CRT data, and he found that CRT is broken down most succinctly in 5 major components, 5 tenets. CRT is broken down most succinctly in 5 major components or 5 tenets. The notion that racism is ordinary and not aberrational, interest convergence, the social construction of race, counter storytelling, and the notion that whites have actually been the beneficiaries of all civil rights legislation. Now, I'm not going to unpack every tenet. I just want to touch on the first 2 and the 4th in order to help us all quickly understand how it relates to the second question and that I wanted to address was how is it being applied in K-12 schools despite legislation forbidding it. The notion that racism is ordinary and not aberrational begins with a fallacy. And that fallacy is that the majority culture in America is racist, maintains elitist control, and that whites, the majority culture, maintain their power and stranglehold on society, a nefarious plot. And it's called systemic racism. That majority culture achieves this by determining the overall ethos of the culture and promoting certain notions like colorblindness and meritocracy. CRT proponents believe that colorblindness and meritocratic rhetoric allow whites to feel consciously irresponsible for the hardships people of color face and encounter. They conclude that racism and white supremacy are the status quo, and that white oppressors exploit black and brown oppressed people by using the values of colorblindness and meritocracy to claim that they're neutral. So colorblindness is no longer an American value in the world of CRT proponents. Neither is meritocracy, which allows whites to have a clear conscience as they use their advantage to outperform the oppressed. Every good work and community service of whites is also held in disdain as they contend that the powerful maintain power and only relinquish portions of it when they have nothing to lose. Furthermore, they receive platitudes and compliments when they do choose to dole out portions of their power to the lesser people of color. The first tenet is foundational to the assumption that there is a need for racial equity and that public schools can be used as a social equalizer through casting the contribution of whites to our nation's redemptive history as evil, the fruit of white supremacist oppression of minorities, completely disregarding the coalition of white Americans who resisted the majority vote trespasses of minority rights over the years, whose founding philosophy, Americanism, is the means to end all forms of racial supremacy. CRT proponents do this to transfer the guilt of one philosophy's advancement of policies by way of mob rule, and that creates a marketable package, which leads to the second tenet, which is interest convergence, which what Dr. Bell, Professor Dr. Bell, Derek Bell, called this strategy an interest convergence. It gives the heirs of a philosophy of mob rule, majority rules, or democracy, which justify the enactment of policies that impacted minorities negatively, a way off the hook for their crimes. And so they're able to get support and a means to coalition build off of the past, anecdotal, or imaginary pain of minorities. So skipping to the fourth, because I've just did the first two. The first one is that racism is ordinary, it's status quo, and it's white supremacy. And the second is that there's an interest convergence. There's got to be something in it for people, for white people to give some of their power over to you. Skipping to the fourth, counter storytelling. This is used to magnify the stories, experiences, narratives, and truths of what CRT proponents consider underprivileged communities, obviously made that way by white supremacy, and not by high tax, high crime, low employment opportunity communities made that way by poor policies and economic experiments. They contend that schools are not neutral spaces that treat everyone justly. And they correlate graduation rates as indicative of a school curricula structured around mainstream white middle class values. And it produces a widening of the racial achievement gap. I mean, it's really conjecture. It's all pure conjecture. Every tenet is essentially just criticism of the prevailing cultural values and efforts to move past racism, or even the efforts to equalize society. They just want to criticize it for a purpose. CRT folks go through great lengths denigrating most court cases, policies, and advancements of the past as purely beneficial to whites. Now, how is this being applied in K-12 schools, despite legislation forbidding it? Through teachers. Well, what I mean is teachers are getting trained to use this particular bent of ideology to inform how they relate to children. That curriculum, even the curriculums that they will choose for the children in the form of discipline employed to equalize the perceived social order in the classroom. CRT is an ideology that is taught to educators to help them engage students through its race-obsessed tenets. In South Carolina, CRT proponents are getting a little help, though, from the SEL development tools like Panorama. Panorama features racial equity development tools that surveys teachers and students along racial and cultural lines to determine the measure of equity and inclusion in their classrooms. Spearman has given districts the ability to build their SEL programs as they see fit, tailored to their communities, and in a June 2020 memo promoted Panorama's survey to be used for that purpose. Again, teaching educators to help them engage students through its race-obsessed tenets. I believe that Panorama's racial equity tools are absolutely a backdoor for surveillance, data gathering, advancement, and implementation of the CRT pedagogy. And I want to know who's getting that information, and I want to know what they're doing with it. Even the SE for Ed teacher advocacy group has resources promoting outright advancement of racially charged works, like Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, which is wholly and completely a work of partisan propaganda. I mean, you just read the description on Amazon, and you can superimpose the three tenets that I briefly described very easily. The vast majority of the tools and resources embedded within CRT philosophy, though, veil it under mostly innocuous and wholesome topics. You have a program called Brain Pop, which I've been informed is available to all South Carolina students. It's rife with partisan concepts and narrativism. And even in the most subtle ways, give you an example, the thumbnail for the topic of Reconstruction and Social Studies section has a blue and red depiction of the United States of America. Blue is on top, red's on the bottom. Now, history demonstrates that at the time, the southern states were in fact Democrats, right? Now, the colors depicting the two sides were likely of no consequence in the late 1800s. Fair enough? However, they do provoke the drawing of inferences today. and advance a partisan narrative. Well, if I was in your positions, how do we respond? This is what I would do. If I was in your position, I would demand that any fruit of the CRT philosophy found in any form be wholly condemned, rejected by the board, and forbidden to be used by teachers or presented to students in the school district. I'm certain that parents in your district don't want resources born of the idea that the highly American values of colorblindness and meritocracy are just tools of preserving white supremacy. They likely also don't appreciate the advancement of ideas that create interest conversions established between CRT proponents and certain political philosophical positions whose mob rule philosophy has justified terrible evils in the name of democracy against minorities in the past by transferring their guilt onto America's systemic racism. We should advance the notion that America is a redemptive gift to the world, whose founding philosophy would end slavery and advance the rights of every minority to participate in the blessings of liberty. We should denounce and reject all forms of racial supremacy. If CRT was really interested in being critical of racial supremacy, then there will be tools addressing every form of racial supremacy. To the board members, do you approve of black supremacy? No, I'm sure you don't. How about Arab supremacy? All forms of racial supremacy are anathema, and that's the American ethos. The American form of government is not systemically racist or advancing white supremacy. It's been the greatest tool to advance freedom, liberty, and prosperity for any race who was blessed to conquer desert, air, and sea to become a United States citizen. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
God bless.